Goedenavond, welkom bij Wij Duiken Veilig, het mini-event online. Mijn naam is Linda Verwerda, ik zit hier met 5 panelleden. Maar voordat we beginnen willen we eerst graag eventjes uitleggen waar Wij Duiken Veilig voor staat. Sander, Kool. Mag ik jou eerst feliciteren? Je hebt gisteren het commando overgenomen over de Defensie Duikgroep. Dus bij deze gefeliciteerd. Maar jij bent ook een van de initiatiefnemers van Wij Duiken Veilig. En kun je iets uitleggen, waar staat het voor?
Ja, dankjewel Linda. Ik weet niet, ben ik in beeld? Nou, kan ik het zo, ja. Dankjewel Linda voor de felicitatie. Ik ben inderdaad gisteren begonnen als commandant van de Defensie Duikgroep. De eenheid waar alle marineduikers in werken. En vanavond Wij Duiken Veilig. We zijn ongeveer 2 jaar geleden begonnen met Wij Duiken Veilig. En hebben we in Houten een eerste symposium georganiseerd. Ja, vanwege de coronacrisis kunnen we dat nu helaas niet weer op die manier doen. En we willen met Duiken Veilig, Wij Duiken Veilig, willen wij een platform zijn waarbij we eigenlijk de hele duikbranche, mensen die professioneel met duiken bezig zijn, met elkaar verenigen. Dat we met elkaar het gesprek opzoeken en voeren over veiligheid. Nou, het liefste doen we dat in een offline setting. Dus zoals we dat de vorige keer gedaan hebben met een netwerkevenement. Dat gaat nu niet. Maar we hebben toch wel bedacht om in ieder geval dit jaar wat te doen. Waarbij we... Staat het geluid uit?
Het geluid staat uit.
Oh.
Oké, ga door. Je bent toch prima te horen. Dus...
Het geluid is prima.
Ja.
Oké, nou, was hier even wat stress. Want
sommige mensen hoorden het niet en velen gelukkig wel.
Oké, nou, ik was aan het vertellen dat we dus vanavond bij elkaar zijn vanwege corona. En helaas dit jaar niet in een offline evenement, maar wel vanavond in een online evenement. Waarbij we een hele interessante spreker hebben. Waar we toch proberen om alle branches... dat gesprek met elkaar te voeren over veiligheid. En dat doen we vanavond met dit online mini-symposium.
Nou, dat klinkt goed. Dan wil ik eigenlijk beginnen om de panelleden voor de paneldiscussie voor te stellen. Eigenlijk, dat gaan ze zelf doen. Thijs, mag ik met jou beginnen?
Ja, goedenavond. Ik ben Thijs Wingelaar. Ik ben duiker bij de Koninklijke Marine. En ik doe wetenschappelijk onderzoek in het AMC.
Cees.
Cees en Toom, Scuba Academie, Vinkerveen. Bijdragen juist vanuit de recreatieve duiksector.
Erwin.
Ik ben Erwin Helderman, teamleider NDCC. Wij zijn betrokken bij het certificeren van beroepsduikers in alle scopes, tot met saturatie.
Leo.
Ik ben Blokland. Ik ben advocaat in het dagelijks leven en gespecialiseerd in risico en aansprakelijkheid. En ik sta nogal wat duikorganisaties, zowel in de commerciële sector als, dat kan ik wel zeggen, de NOB en de DEN bijvoorbeeld bij, als er juridische vraagstukken zijn.
Nou, Sander, jij hebt je net voorgesteld, denk ik. Wil je nog iets toevoegen?
Nou, wat ik wil toevoegen, want ik ben in het dagelijks leven werkzaam voor de Koninklijke Marine. Fantastische organisatie. Maar ik heb in het verleden ook wat werk gedaan voor vrijwilligerswerk voor de Nederlandse Onderwatersportbond. En een aantal jaar geleden nog gewerkt voor de brandweer Amsterdam-Amsteland. Voor de reddingsduikers die daar werkzaam zijn. Dus mijn scope is wat breder dan alleen de marine. Maar ook ervaring met sportduiken en de reddende duiktaak.
Mooi. Dan een huishoudelijke mededeling. We kunnen ons voorstellen dat zometeen tijdens de presentatie van Chris Lemmens dat er een hoop vragen naar boven komen. Stel ze in de chat. We zullen daar een selectie uitmaken die we na afloop aan Chris voorleggen. Zet er eventjes je naam bij en je achtergrond. Kom je uit de beroepssector, kom je uit de recreatieve sector. Dan kunnen we het in de context plaatsen. Ik zeg Chris, kom erin.
Hi Linda.
Hi Chris, how are you?
Are you hearing me okay? Very well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
We're very happy you're here. First of all, we are very happy you're still alive after watching the Netflix movie.
Yeah.
But also, we understood that 2 days ago you were still at sea. So we're happy you're here right now.
I'm just back from 7 weeks. Yeah. So yeah, but yeah, it's good. Lovely tea. I'm glad I was back in time for you. Yeah.
You look good. Chris, do you want to start your presentation? Because we're very curious what you're going to tell us.
Okay. Well, I'll do. Well, I'll introduce myself properly in a minute, but I'll just I'll share my screen and I'll show you a little bit of a video, and then I'll speak to you properly then. Is that okay?
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Please stop me if you can't see anything. Okay, we can see that.
Okay.
We will that structure to appear. Then it appeared.
Okay, scary stuff. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much indeed to you, Linda, and to Sander, and to the rest of you on the committee for having invited me along this evening. It's a real shame, obviously, in this day and age that I can't come and see you all in person, because that would have been much better. But that's just the way it is. So I've been doing quite a few of these over the internet over the winter. So yeah, anyway, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to people who are, first of all, passionate about diving, but also, you know, and in particular, passionate about the safety side of diving. We were having a little chat just before we came online, if you like, about you know, what a good cause this is. Really, I've been involved with a few things like this where people are sort of coming together to try and improve diver safety for the masses, really. I'm very lucky that I work in an industry, or a section of the industry, where safety is a big priority, and money is spent and invested to make that a big priority in what we do. And that's not really the case for everybody, every diver around this planet, as I'm sure most of you are aware. So I think anything that brings people together to discuss these things is really commendable. So my thanks to the committee for allowing me the opportunity to do a little bit on that. I'm going to apologise also for having to do this in English. I've done this a couple of times in French over the winter. I speak a bit of French, and that was pretty much one of the most frightening experiences of my life, to be honest. But my Dutch doesn't really exist, so I'm going to have to do this in English, and I'll try and speak as slowly as possible. So apologies for that. I'm also aware that the majority of you are divers. I'll touch on that in a minute, but often I do this presentation, or the majority of the time I do this presentation, to people who aren't divers. So I tell them about about diving in general and about decompression and why there is a need for saturation diving. So thankfully tonight, not to patronize you, I'm going to skip most of that. Yeah, just lovely to meet you all, and thank you for having me. We're going to try and keep this to about an hour, so apologies if it skips through things a little bit, but I'm going to start a little bit, despite the fact that I'm aware that the majority of you are divers. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about saturation diving and the life of a saturation diver. I don't know how many of you out there are qualified in that sort of sphere of diving, but I'm going to tell you a little about it nonetheless, and then I'm going to go on and tell you I've put there, we call it a quick note on dynamic positioning system. So again, apologies if some of you are aware of what that is, but it's very relevant to the story. So I'm going to very quickly give you a school lesson, if you like, on dynamic positioning systems. And then I'm going to discuss the incident in question, which happened back in 2012. And those of you who have seen the film will obviously be aware of that, but I'm going to show you little clips from the film as well, so apologies for that, but saves you listening to me too much. But it also highlights a lot of things more clearly than I can describe, I suppose. And then we're going to finish up with I believe a question and answer and a bit of a discussion with the panel. So yeah, as I said, I'm a what we call a commercial diver or commercial saturation diver. I understand many of you listening are commercial divers, so normally at this point I would tell people what commercial diving is. I would say to them that, most people think it's something like this, but as we all know, the truth is something more like this. Then I normally go on to tell people about why we need saturation diving and, the need for, how decompression works in scuba diving, for example, and why, because we dive so deep in saturation diving, that isn't feasible on a day-to-day basis. And therefore saturation diving has evolved to facilitate basically working at great depths. But I'm going to skip most of that tonight because you're all attuned to that kind of thing. But I'm going to start, as I said, with telling you a little bit about what saturation diving is in terms of the day-to-day routine and the life that is a saturation diver. There may be some of you who aspire to that kind of thing eventually, or are looking to avoid it, which I would recommend as well. Yeah. Basically, the saturation diving in my world evolves around this boat here, which you can see in the film. And this boat is called it's actually a Dutch boat now. It belongs to Biscalis now. At the time of the incident, it was called the Bibi Topaz, and it became the Riva Topaz, and is now the Boca Topaz. She is a diving support vessel. She is about 107 meters long, 22 meters wide. She was built in 2007. She's got a couple of big cranes on the back there, as you can see, a 150-ton main crane and a 20-ton dragon crane. And she has about 105 people on board, plus 18 divers normally. So that sort of 105 people on board this vessel are there entirely to allow two people, or two divers more specifically, to work on the seabed. So it's a big operation. She looks innocuous from, like a pretty standard boat from the outside, but internally she is built around the saturation diving complex. So I'm sure some of you have, a decent idea of what that is. But in a nutshell, just to explain very briefly what saturation diving is, I suppose, at the bottom and the center of the boat, of the Topaz, we have these decompression chambers, along with a diving bell there that you can see on the screen. And normally I would tell people about nitrogen narcosis and oxygen toxicity and things like that, and the length of decompression required from great depths, but you guys know all about that. So I'll just tell you really how we solve that problem with saturation diving, which is that on day one we would go into that chamber you can see in front of you. We close the door, and the entire chamber is pressurized down to what we call an equivalent working depth. So if we're going to be working at 100 meters, for example, the system in front of you, once 12 divers are in there, which is four teams of 3, each to work a 6-hour shift on the bottom, would enter that chamber, the door would be closed, and it would be pressurized down to probably about 90 meters in that example. So about 10 meters off the seabed. And once you are pressurized down to that, which takes about an hour or maybe 2 hours, you would then live in that environment, and you live in that environment for up to 28 days, which is the legal limit in the North Sea, certainly in the UK sector of the North Sea. And then each day, the diving bell that you saw before locks onto the top of these chambers. The teams of 3 divers climb up into those diving bells. They're then separated from the system, trolleyed across, and then drop down to the equivalent working depth. So in this example, down to 90 meters. And when you get to 90 meters and you open the bottom door, because you've got an equivalence of pressure inside and out, the water doesn't come in, you've got a dry environment, and you don your diving gear, your helmet and all the rest of it, and you drop the last 10 meters down to the seabed. You work for 6 hours. After 6 hours, you return to the diving bell, close the bottom door, and then return to the ship and back onto the chambers. Locked on, you drop down, have a cup of tea and something to eat, and read a magazine, go to sleep, and get up and do the same thing the next day. So that is repeated in this example for maybe 23 of those days, 24 of those days, at which point you stop diving and you remain in the chambers and you decompress very, very slowly back to the surface over the last 4 days. So what you're basically doing in saturation diving is one very, very long dive with a single decompression at the end. And that in a nutshell solves all the problems of oxygen toxicity, but most importantly of the very long decompression times required from those kind of depths. Apologies again if you're sort of familiar with all that kind of thing, but I thought I'd give you a very quick recap, particularly for those of you who don't know anything about that. But life in saturation is a strange one for those of you who don't know anything about it. The biggest difficulty of the job for me is absolutely living in those conditions. So the diving is very much the easy bit. The more difficult bit is living in very close confines for 28 days at a time with people you might not necessarily get on with. So I've always felt that one of the biggest skills in this job is being a pretty, a reasonably decent human being and having the ability to get on with people in a very small space, because it is a difficult place to live. It's definitely not suited to everybody. If you're claustrophobic or if you value your privacy, then it's not the place for you. It's as I said, it's a place where privacy is at a premium. You're on camera, as I think I'm pointing out there, all of the time. So having a shower, going to the toilet, every single second of your life is on camera, and it's also lived in very, very close proximity to other people. So the need to be clean and tidy, to make sure you have a shower every day, ridiculous as that sounds, these are important things for a saturation diver, because people won't tolerate living with people they won't get on with. I think you probably find that in diving in general, that there's a misconception that it's quite a macho, if you like, profession or an environment. But certainly on the Topaz where I work, we find that's not really the case, because the sort of people who are like that, who are aggressive or macho types, if you like, don't really tend to last very long, because they're not the kind of people want to live with in those close confines. So being a decent human being gets you a long way in saturation diving, I think. So yeah, people always ask me, how can I make it in sat diving, and that's usually the first bit of advice I give them, is just be a decent person. But it is very much like living in prison. It's a life of routine. It's a life of having to ask to go to the toilet, to ask for somebody to flush it, to having a menu sent into you at the same time every day, and having to fill it out, and people bring your food on a silver tray. I've had lots of Christmas dinners in a saturation system. So it's definitely not for everybody. It's a very rewarding career, but it's a difficult one. And I would definitely say that the living environment is the biggest drawback for a lot of people, and you need to be prepared to be able to cope with those kind of conditions for long periods, because certainly when times are good, you can perhaps spend 6 months of your year living in the sort of system you can see in front of you there. What turns up to ends up being years of your life. So it's a big decision to go down that road, and I understand why people do, but people perhaps don't realize quite what it involves. That is a typical saturation system. That is not the one from the Topaz, but that's a very very similar kind of thing. So you've got four living chambers that you can see there, where the people, where the divers live day in, day out. And this is a twin bell, what we call a twin bell system. So it has 2 diving bells. That's for 2 reasons, really. On the Topaz is a twin bell system. So firstly, it facilitates 24-hour-a-day diving, because when one of the bells goes down, and as I described, the 3 divers are out working for their 6 hours, the second diving bell will come down before the end of that 6 hours, and the next team of 3 will lock out, drop to the seabed, and you'll literally tag team on the bottom, and they will take over what you're doing. So the boat is able to work 24 hours a day without any interruption. The other big advantage is that the second bell works as a rescue bell. So, if you do have any problems with the first bell, for any reason, you have a second bell to go and rescue the occupants. There are still a lot of single bell systems around, and they are reliant on other boats basically being in the vicinity to come and rescue them, in the event of a serious emergency. Both sides, on either side there, you can see the 2 lifeboats, and they're obviously not lifeboats, they're hyperbaric lifeboats. You can see the little tunnel running up from the saturation system up to the lifeboat. So in the event of an emergency, a fire, or the sinking of the ship, then the worst case scenario is that you're in the water, and you need to come all the way back to the bell, back to the ship, be locked on, and then make your way to these hyperbaric lifeboats and be locked into them, and hope that there are a team of people outside willing to stay on board while the ship's sinking to launch you. Which if we're realistic about these things, is not very likely. But basically, inside each of those lifeboats is a chamber similar to the ones you see in the middle there, to allow the divers to sort of remain at pressure and decompress whilst they are being rescued or taken to a safe haven. Again, apologies if this is all familiar to you, but yeah, I'll give you a bit of a highlight. Couple of quick photos. That's a typical saturation control. So there, like I said, there can be up to 18 divers within the chambers on the Topaz, and they are entirely reliant on the team of people outside, the life support supervisors, life support technicians, who primarily are there to monitor the life support systems, the gases, the levels of oxygen, the levels of carbon dioxide, and so on, the heat, humidity. But they're also there to facilitate the day-to-day needs of divers in a system. So you need your laundry doing, you need food bringing to you, you need your rubbish taking out and things like that, because you are entirely dependent on the people outside. So very, very valuable members of the team. That's sort of the living side, and the working side of diving is controlled from dive control, which on our boat is just upstairs from the living chambers. This is again a twin bell system, so you have a replica, one for the starboard bell and one for the port bell, and in those chairs sit the diving supervisors who control the dives themselves, usually flanked by engineers telling them what to do, who then pass it on to the divers. And in the North Sea these days, or particularly in the UK section of the North Sea, it's very, very procedure based. It's the sort of autonomy, the independence of the diver has been lost a little bit. We do very much paint by numbers. It's very procedure based. We basically are the hands of the engineers really these days. We don't think too much for ourselves, truth be told. We follow procedure, and that's all directed from the dive control up there. That's a photo from the Topaz, a sort of motley crew, but I only share that really to illustrate the confines of a diving bell. So that's inside the diving bell on the Topaz. And as you can see, with all the diving equipment, the umbilicals, the hats, all the safety equipment, tools, gauges, pipe work, and 3 divers, of course, there's very, very little room left, which is fine on a day-to-day basis. It makes things a little bit awkward, but it's particularly pertinent in an emergency situation. So, such as the one I'm about to tell you about, it gives you a little bit of an idea of how little space there is for people to facilitate a rescue, or particularly if you ever had to bring 2 divers back, for example. It's a very, very difficult place to work in that kind of situation. A little tour.
Hi boys.
Unfortunately, as you can see, there's not a huge deal of space. Probably only half a foot or so between the bunks down here. Dunk's in there getting his ready. And then this is the living end. Got sort of benches and a bit of a table. One of the very few portholes we've got, so that's pretty much the only sight of the outside world that you'd have. So I've got to crawl through these little tunnels to get from place to place. And down this way is what we call the wet pot. So I just push that door open. Basically the toilet and the shower room, so various ablutions and that kind of thing. Yeah, if I stand my full height, there's absolutely everything that can knock my head on. It's a real pain for me. That's why I've always got gashes all over me. And the magic of it is, once you've done the full circuit, you're back to where you started. And a cup of tea. And a cup of tea, yeah.
Miami chocolate stash.
That's ridiculous, Duncan. How much have you got in there?
Just a bar for every day.
A bar for every day.
I've already started just to check him out. Yeah.
Glad I'm with you. That's, if you've seen the film, that's obviously the very lovely Duncan, who is literally as nice as he seems. But that gives you a little bit of an insight, albeit in a film version of the inside of the chambers, and how claustrophobic and small they can be. And I can literally barely stand up in them. So that's something to be aware of when you're considering being a saturation diver. But yeah, there you go. So it's a routine, as I said, of lack of privacy. I do equate it to prison quite a lot. It does feel like you do the same thing at the same time every day, and you've also got to be somebody who can deal with the fact that there is no escape. There is no easy or quick way out of those chambers. If your appendix bursts, or if your mother dies, or any sort of crisis, there is still no circumnavigating the days of decompression required to get out of that place. Some people make, sorry about the English, but yeah, an analogy of, they compare it to spacemen, which I think is far too flattering. You've got to be clever to be a spaceman, and you don't to be a diver. But there is truth. That people say it's quicker to get back from the moon, and it takes 3 days to get back from the moon. If you're at 150 meters in a saturation system, it's going to take you 6 days to get back. So there is no getting around that, and you need to be somebody who can deal with that once the door is shut, because it definitely isn't for everybody. We often see hardened divers, people who've been air divers for many years, and they turn up in saturation, and they really struggle with it. There we go. As I said, very quickly, before we get onto the meat and drink of the accident, I'm quickly going to talk to you about dynamic positioning systems. I only tell you because it's got such relevance to the stories, but obviously we've talked there about the living side of things, but we're there to work. So in order to allow divers to work at one point on the seabed, sorry for the very poor homemade graphics, but it's vital that the ship, so in this case the Topaz, be able to stay in one position over the seabed. In shallow water and the Far East and places like that, often you would drop anchors to allow a barge or whatever to stay in one place. But in the deep waters of the North Sea, or in many other places around the world, and also in places where you have a large infrastructure of pipelines and so on the bottom, that you don't really want anchors knocking into, then that's not a possibility. So they've developed what they call these dynamic positioning systems, which basically these are a computer which is sited on the bridge, which works off several references. So it uses GPS systems, so satellites, radar scans, so reflective things on platforms, beacons on the seabed, and also taut wires, which are basically weighted wires which drop down to the seabed. And as the boat moves, the angle of inclination is fed back to the computer, and the computer uses all these different references, which basically feed back the movement of the boat caused by the wind and the waves and the tide and everything else. And then the computer then instructs the thrusters, the various propellers and thrusters around the ship to counteract those and allow the vessel to stay in a single position with apart from the day in question, with extreme accuracy. To give you an example, I can be on the seabed and with the boat above me, and I can ask the ship to move with a load on the crane, 7 meters on 23 degrees, and the boat will move serenely in that direction, even in pretty bad weather. So it's a remarkable system as long as it works. Just a quick film of us going to work there. So this, I think, is actually from the day in question, but that's to give you another little insight into the close confines of the bell, if you like. That's the three of us, Duncan, Dave and myself, going up. And then you can see the bell being launched down through the moon pool as I described. Yeah, just a quick bit of footage for those of you who haven't seen it before. It's the launching system. You can see the bell door is on the bottom on this system. You get some where it's on the side, and it's lowered then through the moon pool down to depth. And to show you that same thing in very poor graphics, you can see the diving bell, which is lowered down through that moon pool you just saw there. It's lowered down to usually about, we have a sort of a rule where whatever structure is on the seabed, the bell needs to be about 5 meters above it. So most structures down there are maybe 5 or 6 meters tall. So the bell is often about 10 meters above the seabed. And once we're in position, the first diver will jump out of the bell, drop to the bottom and begin working. And then he'll closely be followed by what we call diver 2. So the second diver, he'll come out, and we always dive in teams of 3, and the third diver will always remain in the diving bell. It's a position we rotate every day. So one day you'll be diver 1, one day you'll be diver 2, and the third day you effectively get a day off and sit in the bell for 6 hours reading a book and monitoring the gases and the umbilicals. So that's how we sort of work on a daily basis. And again, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but people do often wonder what we do on the seabed. And I mean, people always assume that you're working on platforms and things like that, and we do work on platforms a lot of the time. I work almost exclusively within the oil industry, and we can spend times alongside and up against platforms, inspecting welds and so on and so forth, or bringing risers in and anything else related to the rigs themselves, or jackups or whatever it is. But the vast majority of the work that we do, particularly as saturation divers, is on the seabed, and people often don't realize that the majority of the infrastructure, the pipelines, the wellheads, the manifolds, the hydraulics, the electronics involved in bringing oil and gas back to the surface lies on the seabed. So my job basically involves either installing or maintaining or repairing, or more and more these days removing, decommissioning these fields on the seabed. So it's varied work. It's these pictures are definitely not in the North Sea, I would say. They look like they're out in Thailand. The visibility is often very poor. I'm sure you're very familiar with that, working down in Dutch waters. And there are days when you're doing, fairly intricate electronics or hydraulics, or, putting spools and pipelines together, as in these pictures. But, equally, a lot of the time you're pulling sandbags all over the seabed. It's definitely not a glamorous job, that's for sure. Okay. That hopefully is your 101 to saturation diving. I'm sure a lot of you have seen that before, but I know what most of you are here for tonight is to hear about the accident we had on the Topaz, which was back on the 12th of September 2012. So it's just coming up to 9 years ago now. It seems like yesterday, to be honest, but quite a way ago now. We were working at the time at a place called the Huntingdon Manifold, which is about 90 miles east of Aberdeen. That pretty much puts you in the middle of the North Sea, so halfway between the UK and Norway, along that, Norway and Denmark, sort of that spine of oil fields which runs down the middle. We were working at 91 meters, 275 feet. Pretty standard for the North Sea, not particularly deep. That night we had 35 knot winds and 6 meter seas, or 6 meter swell, certainly, which when I read it out, or when I read it there, sounds fairly extreme, but in truth, as I'm sure many of you know, for the North Sea, that's fairly standard weather. If we weren't able to work in those kind of conditions, then we would never work at all. And that dynamic positioning system that I described on the Topaz is you know, and the design of the ship itself renders it very, very capable of working in those kind of conditions. That's not to say that wasn't close to not being able to dive, but it definitely was diveable. It was a factor in what happened. It exacerbated, so it made what happened worse, perhaps. But it wasn't the root cause of the accident. You know, the weather was a factor, but it wasn't the root cause, if that makes sense. That time of year, so September, at the bottom, probably a sea temperature of about 4 degrees. And we were working at around 10 o'clock at night, which is not really relevant to us on the bottom because at 91 meters, there's very little light that penetrates anyway. But it was relevant to the crew on the bridge because, as we'll come to describe, they had a complete blackout of everything, all their screens and all their systems. And we were working in open water that night. So we were nowhere near a rig or anything. So there was no frame of reference, nothing for them, you know, no light for them to orientate themselves from. They were totally black and dead in the water, basically, a very, very difficult situation for them. But for us on the bottom, it was very much a normal day at the office.
And basically, you see your A and B. We open in and closing them in a sequence. And pressure test.
So my colleague Dave Uasa and I were working within this manifold, which was basically a series of wellheads within a manifold called the Huntington template. I think Dave was just taking a blind flange off, and I was working nearby doing some barrier testing, so some pressure testing prior to us removing another blind flange or another section of pipe work. The structure itself was very open. It was quite a new structure. I'm sure a lot of you experienced this, but you know, there's a lot of the structures we work within are very difficult to get in and out of, poor access and egress and lots of things to get caught on. But that wasn't really the case, unfortunately, at the Huntington manifold. It was nice and wide and open and actually quite well designed for diver access. And the job that we were doing was, you know, very much run of the mill. It was the kind of thing that we do every day. Visibility that day was actually quite good, which is unusual. We could see the diving bell from the job site. It was pretty close, and our umbilicals were running nice and straight back to it. So, yeah, a normal day at the office, as I said, that, you know, as much as it ever can be in the North Sea, and that was up until at least we heard the alarms.
And then it started. I saw alarm which I never seen before. Immediately after this alarm, more faults coming one by one.
So this was basically the catastrophic failure, the root cause of the incident, which was the failure of the dynamic positioning system. And the first we knew about it on the bottom was hearing the alarms through the earpieces in our helmets. Now, hearing alarms, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, is not an unusual occurrence, certainly during twin bell operations on a saturation system, because often you'll hear, you know, carbon dioxide alarms, oxygen alarms. And also, before the other bell goes down, all the dynamic positioning alarms are tested as well. So we hear alarms in the background all the time, so we don't usually think too much of it. And indeed, when we heard these, although they sounded louder than normal, it didn't really, you know, it didn't equate that to a serious problem. But very soon after that, Craig Frederick, who was our dive supervisor on the night, was telling us to make our way out of the structure as quickly as possible. And you could just tell from the tone of his voice, the way he was saying it, that this wasn't a drill. You know, this wasn't pretend. There was something serious going on. We didn't necessarily know what that was, but we knew there was a problem. And so we did as he said, and as it says there, try to make an orderly exit from the structure. this is real footage from the night, as a lot of the stuff in the film is. Some things are recreations, but this is my hat camera footage from the night. And as you can see, there's not too much panic. We're making our way out relatively calmly, as we all do, of course. As divers, we are watching our umbilicals, and we've both got our umbilicals in our hands, making sure they don't catch on anything. There's plenty of valves and bits of pipework for them to catch on. But it was a relatively easy exit from the structure, and within 20 seconds we were exiting the structure and dropping down to the seabed. Fully expecting at that point, though, to see the bell directly in front of us. As I said, it had been hung just a few meters away from us. We could see it right in front of us when we came in, but as we came out, it wasn't there, which was strange, obviously, but not unusual. It's not unusual for us not to see the bell. But what was strange was that our umbilicals, which had been straight in front of us, were now wrapped behind us and going over the top of this structure. I think even at that point, I still didn't really work out what was going on. I wasn't thinking too much about it. All I could hear was Craig telling us to get back to the diving bell, to get back to the stage, so the platform under the bell. So that's what we did. We turned, and obviously the only way to get back to the bell is to follow your umbilical. So at that point, Craig is asking Duncan, who's in the bell, to come up on our umbilicals. He can only do one at a time, so he chose Dave's for whatever reason. But it didn't really matter. We had to climb our umbilicals, and as we did so, the structure was about 10 meters tall. And when I got to the top, I knew straight away that I would have left a loop of umbilical behind me, as had Dave. So I turned to free that, or to make sure it didn't catch on anything, really, as we all would. But at that point, it just happened so incredibly quickly. I realized that it had caught on this what was a transponder bucket. So it's a metal outcrop. It actually shouldn't have been there, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, there's always plenty of things to get caught on, but the speed that it happened, the film sort of loops the footage, so it belies just how quickly it happened. The moment I sort of dropped down to try and free it, it was pulled under and upwards and caught. And I realized very, very quickly at that point that I was in some kind of trouble. But I felt powerless to do anything about it, really. Dave probably describes it better than I do.
Structure, boys.
When I was nearly at the top, I noticed that Chris didn't seem to be going any further. I could tell something was wrong.
Chris had a loop of umbilical wrapped around his outcrop. He was trapped. It started to get tighter and tighter. I've never seen an umbilical this tight. Chris could see the tension in it. He was asking for slack out of the bell. He couldn't get the slack out of the bell because the ship kept moving away.
Chris, we cannot give you any slack.
So like I said, I think that happens a lot faster. Seemed to happen a lot faster in real life than it does on the film there. But above us on the bridge, they had essentially had a complete failure of all their systems. So the computer which controls the dynamic positioning system had failed, and the backup had failed, and the backup to the backup had failed. Something which simply isn't supposed to happen particularly on a DP class 2 vessel like the Topaz. But they were faced with a situation where they had no control of the vessel. They were trying to they leapt to try and control it manually with the joysticks they have up there, but in the face of the weather and a lack of any kind of reference, that's a task they found basically impossible, and they never really managed to get control of the ship manually. The captain was dragged out of his bed to help, and the chief officer and the captain were opposite each other, holding two joysticks each, wrestling and trying to mostly just trying to keep the nose, the bow of the ship into the weather. That was about as much control as they could ever wrestle. down below, as the boat became a sailboat and it's moving away from my position, I'm essentially an anchor to 5,000 odd tons of ship, and there's only ever going to be one winner in that, one winner, sorry, in that situation. And the first thing I knew about it, I knew there was a lot of tension on it, on the umbilical, and I was thrashing around, trying to free it and to free myself. My first worry really that I was being pulled down towards where the loop was going through, and my first thought was my legs were spreading across the top bar of the structure, and I thought, oh, my legs are gonna break, and this is going to be horribly painful. And the second thing I worried about was that I would keep getting pulled down, and I would get pulled down through the tiny gap that my umbilical was passing through, and it would have been like passing through a cheese grater, and not a very nice way to finish. But thankfully, I suppose, eventually the umbilical became so tight that it wasn't moving anymore. But what it was doing was stretching, and the first thing to sort of succumb to that pressure was my comms cable, which I think internally must have stretched to the point that it broke, and it was like a screeching, like a jack being pulled out the back of a stereo. And I lost all communication with the surface, and I lost my light, and the camera obviously went as well. Which was a disconcerting moment, because you've gone from the security of having somebody talking to you to suddenly to darkness and to complete silence, and just the sound of my own breath and swearing as I try and free myself from that position. So obviously I'm really feeling the strain, but Duncan up in the bell is also feeling that same strain, even more than I am in some ways.
Chris's umbilical went so tight that it actually started pulling his stainless steel umbilical rack off the wall. I was shitting myself. I was literally waiting for the inevitable, just to all go through the hole in the floor. And if I got between it and the hole, I would be going out with it.
So difficult moments for Duncan. Down on the bottom, obviously difficult moments for me as well. Soon after I lost the communications cable, I think my gas hose must have become stretched so much that it kinked. So it was before the umbilical broke. I lost the flow of gas to my hat, which for those of you amongst you who've ever experienced that, is never a good thing, is it? When you suddenly don't have anything to breathe. But it's also something we train for, and it's a very automatic process to reach for the knob on the side of our helmets, which opens the supply of gas to our bailout bottles. So for me that night, I had two 7-litre, a twin set 7-litre on my back with an emergency supply of gas. But as soon as you do that, you're moving into a different world, one from an infinite supply of gas to a very, very finite supply of gas, which is panic inducing. Obviously, the situation. I think at that point I still didn't really fully understand what was happening, but I knew the situation was getting very, very serious. I'd never had to do that myself in anger before. I'd done it in training, but never for real. So a scary moment in itself. Dave, who, as you heard, had realized there was a problem, had turned, and he was trying to get back to me, but the boat, which eventually ended up 250 meters away, was pulling him backwards. So he was able to get to within maybe 2 meters of me, and we could sort of look into each other's eyes. And I can remember him sort of looking at me, almost apologizing with his eyes, because we couldn't speak at that point, that he couldn't get back to me. And I remember almost looking at him and saying goodbye. But again, he describes it far better than I do.
But maybe less than 2 meters apart, the visibility is good enough that we can look into each other's faces. I can see that he's in trouble. But that's now me at the end of my umbilical. And I can't get to him. His umbilical is getting thinner. You can hear it creaking. It's the noise that something makes before it breaks.
I can remember Dave being pulled away from me, and it was very much like he describes, like a cinematic moment where I could sort of see him, and he was being pulled away in the darkness, and all of a sudden I could only see his light, and then his light disappeared, and I never saw him again. And yeah, very shortly after that, the umbilical itself broke like a shotgun going off. I don't particularly remember hearing it. Dave certainly does, but I remember suddenly being plunged from a world of Dave's light, of heavy breathing and all that kind of thing, and a lot of tension, to suddenly the tension being released, and I fell backwards from the structure down to the seabed, and found myself in the most complete and absolute darkness. I think as divers we've all experienced darkness, and some of us experienced it going to the toilet at night, haven't we? But it was the most complete darkness I think I've ever known. I couldn't see a speck of light anywhere, and it's very, very disorientating. And I remember sort of landing eventually on my back 10 meters down, and almost having a couple of seconds of disbelief. Where am I? What am I doing? And eventually getting my senses together and scrambling to my feet clumsily, and realizing that I didn't know where I was, even though the structure can only have been a couple of meters away. I had no idea in which direction that was. As I'm sure you all know, as a diver, the surface is never a good option. But as a saturation diver, it's just not an option. It's you have one safe haven only, and that is the diving bell. An ascent to the surface is basically a death sentence by explosive decompression. So there's only one place you can go in that situation, and that is the diving bell. So that's all you think about, and that is finding your way to that. So my thoughts were to get myself back onto the top of the structure, see the diving bell, and probably see Dave coming back to get me. So that's all I thought about, but I didn't know which way that was going to be. So obviously I had a lot of good fortune that night, but the first dose of good fortune was literally putting my hands out in front of me and choosing a direction to walk in. And I was very lucky that after a couple of paces I bumped into the metal of the structure. I could very easily have walked in the other direction and found myself in no man's land, and that would have rendered the rescue far more difficult, or finding me more difficult. As it was, I found it, because it was such an open structure. There was no obvious way to climb up it, so I can remember desperately hanging on to it, with a foot or a hand, not wanting to lose it in case I would walk it from the wrong direction, and edging my way along until I just bumped into it was a hose, actually. So it was a pressure testing downline that we'd previously been using. I didn't really know what it was, but it felt firm. I gave it a pull, and I started to climb it, fully expecting when I got to the top, which I did. I climbed over the top, and I remember really expecting to look up and see the diving bell there in front of me, and it wasn't there. There was nothing but the same darkness that I was seeing on the bottom, which was very, very dispiriting. I can remember that being the moment really where things changed, because I suddenly thought, this is suddenly going to be life-threatening. So emotional moments started on the bottom, 0 minutes as it says there, but up above me it's as bad for Duncan, because he still has to pull in the umbilical.
I was hoping I was pulling Chris in, but in my heart of hearts I knew I wasn't. I knew there was nothing on the end. Hot water clothes came in first, broken and tattered at the end. And I had another couple of wraps of umbilical to pull in before a broken end of his gas hose came in. Now that is making quite an immense noise. I put my hand on the regulator to turn it off. never, ever turn a diver's gas off when he's in the water. It's tantamount to killing him. I did feel as though I was letting Chris down. That was the end of his lifeline to the bell. I could have cried at that point. I didn't know to be sick, cry, whatever. I just shouted, "I've lost my diver. I've lost my diver." And I didn't know what was happening to Dave, so I had to be sensible and pull myself back together.
Obviously emotional time for Duncan, who'd been a bit of a father figure to me in my diving career to that point. So, you know, we were friends as well as colleagues. So, yeah, hard times. But for me on the bottom, it was a strange moment really, because I remember, you know, when I realised the bell wasn't there, you sort of, I won't say I quite did the maths, but, you know, you have a little think about what you might have left in your bailout at that depth. The film, I think if you've seen the film, it sort of makes it out to be 5 minutes. But if you do the maths properly, it's actually 9 minutes, probably, if you work on the IMCA 40 litres a minute, you know, rescue or emergency breathing rate. You know, I didn't have that figure in my head, but I knew it wasn't going to be a long time. You know, maybe 5 or 6 minutes. I knew I'd use quite a bit of time breathing heavily to get myself back to the top of the structure. And, you know, I knew there wouldn't have been long left. And even if Dave had been right in front of me coming to rescue me, I knew the chances of him getting me back to the bell and getting my helmet off before I ran out of gas were already pretty slim. And the fact that there was no sign of him at all made me realize fairly quickly that, you know, I certainly thought I probably wasn't going to be able to get out of this. But that had a strangely calming effect. I think because I realized there was nothing I could do. I couldn't rescue myself. You know, as I said, the surface is not an option. It calmed me down in a strange sort of way, and a resignation came over me, almost an acceptance that this was going to be it. And my breathing rate naturally calmed, and yeah, it was an emotional time, obviously, I you know, for me on the bottom, but, you know, also, as I said, for Duncan in the bell, who'd become a friend.
I knew Chris. I knew Morag. I was wondering how we're going to explain it to we went on a dive and he never came back. Yeah, I was struggling to contain myself.
On the bottom, I think once the sort of the time came when I realised that, you know, at least I thought this was going to be it. I made my way to the middle of the structure, and I couldn't see anything. I remember being worried that the current, the tide was going to wash me off the side, and I would be even more difficult to find. And I kind of curled up in a little ball on the, you know, almost a fetal position in the middle of the structure. And I was looking up, hoping, but you know, the truth is that I thought this was going to be it. And it's a strange sensation. I don't like to make too much of it, because, you know, there are plenty of people around the world who are given death sentences, if you like, you know, cancer patients and worse. And, you know, and I sitting here before you healthy and well. So, but at the time it felt, they felt like very, very sad times. And I remember not being frightened particularly, but being very, very, as I said, very sad. And it was almost like grief. And I remember thinking particularly of the people at home, and the enormous damage I was going to do to those that I love. And, you know, I thought of my fiance at the time being told, my parents being told, you know, and the horrible pain that this is going to cause. You know, I was, you know, a place in my life where I was about to get married the following year. We were in the process of building a new house, you know, an exciting time. You know, and I remember thinking this is all going to be taken away from me in this very strange and lonely place. you know, the underwater world can be a beautiful place, can't it? You know, but at that moment it seemed like a very desolate and lonely one, and I didn't really understand. I remember being in shock almost that, you know, a little boy basically, which is what we all are at heart, had suddenly found himself in this strange and alien and lonely place, and was about to die there. And I can remember calling out, I think I say that in the film, I remember calling out to Morag saying, you know, I'm so sorry that I've put myself in this selfish position. I've chosen this career that is going to cause you such pain in the end. And I can also remember calling out Duncan's name, you know, hoping that he would drop out of the sea above me to save me, which was ridiculous because Dave was the one in the water with me and it would have been him coming to get me. But for some reason I thought of him, and, you know, in those lonely moments. So sad moments. I won't say I'd given up hope, but I certainly didn't think there was any. But you know, above me, people hadn't thankfully lost hope.
But at no point did I allow myself to think that we weren't going to get him back. Definitely not. There was no way where I was going to go home and explain to Morag that Chris wasn't coming back.
On the bottom, yeah, so I put in the real figure there, maybe 9 minutes, but I'll never know. It was so dark that I couldn't even make out my gauge, which is probably a good thing in retrospect. I think obviously that would have been a ticking clock and panic-inducing in itself. But I remember thinking this was taking a lot longer than I thought it would. But eventually I did start to feel the breathing getting difficult, as you do when you get to the bottom of a cylinder, as I'm sure some of you know. And I can remember sort of thinking, oh, you know, this is it. You know, I hope it doesn't hurt. But the moment of passing, you know, what felt like into death, but obviously was just into unconsciousness at that point, was one I don't really remember. I often describe it, you know, I think you went to sleep last night and you remember maybe having a cup of cocoa and talking to somebody on the phone and checking the news and then putting your head down and thinking about things, but you don't remember the moment you fell asleep. And that was very much the case for me that night. You know, I don't remember the moment of going into unconsciousness, and I don't remember it being an unpleasant one. You know, hopefully that my real death is something like that in itself. But yeah, for me, however, when that did happen, that's sort of the end of my part in the story, really. I'm sort of the damsel in distress after that. And I'm sorry, I'm conscious of taking a bit longer than I should have done, so I'll go quickly through the rest. But yeah, at that point, the boat was still nearly 250 meters away from me. They still had no control over the boat at all. But what they did have was an ROV, as you see there on the screen, on board with I think it had a 300 meter long tether, and that was able to get back across to my position. I had a beacon on me, and they were able to get range and bearing on that beacon, and the footage you saw at the beginning of the presentation and that you see in the film is from that ROV. But that real footage, I'll show you a little bit more there. Really, I only show people this not to try and scare them, but a couple of things there. You can see the water line in the hat. I don't know if you can see that, you know, which again is one of the many things that beggars belief. I have to assume that wasn't in my mouth and nose, but also this twitching. I talk about oxygen toxicity in a normal presentation, and I know we've got some physicians in the audience tonight, so I'd be interested to hear their take on it, whether they think that's O2 toxicity. I personally don't think it is. I think it's probably sort of a carbon dioxide issue, and also the current and, you know, the last vestiges of life, if you like. But yeah, this footage goes on for nearly, you know, 35 minutes, which is a very, very long time. Not really for me because I'm unconscious, but for those who had to witness it on the boat that night. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. In that, you know, the trauma suffered that night wasn't really by me or by my colleagues. It was more by everybody who had to witness what they thought was a colleague, or what was a colleague, and hopefully for some of them a friend, you know, dying in front of them, which is harrowing to watch, obviously. As I said, on the bridge, they continued to search for a solution, but the truth is they never found one. And what they did do in the end, we have a Norwegian crew on board, and they call this the Swedish solution, which we're all familiar with, which is basically they turned the computer off and they turned it on again. And thankfully that rebooted all the system. The reason they hadn't done that before, people often ask me, why didn't they do that before? But I think they were worried about turning it off and nothing coming back, and they would lose the little control that they did have. But eventually they were basically left with no choice. They turned it off, they turned it on again, and the dynamic positioning system was able to reboot. And they were able to move back to my position in a controlled fashion. But at that point, nearly 35 minutes had passed. But once they did get there, Dave, who was still on the stage, having had a really traumatic return to the bell himself, was then able to come down and fetch me. And I'll sort of probably skip by this because I'm a bit short of time. But they, an amazing effort. They moved the bell down to. We normally have this golden rule where you don't bring the bell down to within 5 meters of the structure, but they lowered it to just 2 meters above, just to make his life a bit easier. You've got to picture that bell is going up and down, 4, 5, 6 meters, a big swell above him. He drops down. What you can see him doing there is putting his pneumofovometer hose up my neck dam to try and give me a little bit of gas. Again, one of the many little things that may have saved me. He checked my umbilical, and the RV's checking my umbilical to check that it's not caught on anything. And then he pulls me back, and I'm about 6'5" and quite heavier than I should be. He's an extremely fit guy, Dave, but he found it immensely difficult. I had no buoyancy because mine had been severed with my umbilical, and he had no buoyancy because he'd tried to give me his gas hose. So he sort of climbed that 2 or 3 meters back up to the bell. And, and he said that, if he hadn't got me onto the stage on the last attempt, he would have had to drop me back to the seabed. He was just so physically tired from that effort. And, he's a man who can do hundreds of chin-ups with his fingers only, that kind of guy, rock climber fit. So, an effort I can obviously never thank him enough for. He saved my life, as they both did that night. Very, very difficult for him. We learned lots of things from that I might talk to you about later if we have time. But you can see the boat going up and down, and just how hard that was. Eventually, however, he is able to get me onto the stage and feed me up into the trunking of the bell. But at that point, nearly 40 minutes has passed, and they're obviously not holding out much hope. And this is a recreation. I'll probably skip through that. Duncan took off my helmet. He said I was sort of blue with my head was completely blue, which may have been cyanosis, may just have been the cold. Interested again to hear what you think. But he gave me 2 rescue breaths, and apparently I came around straight away, but I violently exhaled, which maybe suggests that there was a blockage to the esophagus, to the windpipe. Who knows? But I came around very quickly. I was very groggy and almost drunk, and I don't really remember that. But I was eventually able to climb back up into the bell on my own, which made things much easier for them. And then Dave was able to climb up afterwards, and I think he was in shock more than anyone else. He was expecting
that he was more than likely dead.
Expecting to come back to a dead body.
I started to come to terms with the fact that he was dead, and that we'd recovered a body.
Again, that's real footage from the night.
I could see Chris sat down there, and he was definitely not dead. That was very confusing.
So slightly groggy, but otherwise entirely unharmed. And I'll probably move by this. But if you've seen that in the film, that's Stu, who was one of the diver medics who received me. And what I usually talk about when he comes up is how he gets very emotional in the film, and it illustrates how much it affected other people. We almost had the euphoria and the joy of getting through the accident, whereas many people who had to watch it and were involved in another capacity suffered far more than we did, which was a strange phenomenon. I think true of a lot of traumas, if you like. As to the recovery, I often say to people that the recovery was amazing. The survival was, seems like an amazing thing to be able to survive that long with nothing to breathe. But for me, it's more the fact that I recovered, and I recovered with no damage due to oxygen deprivation, or at least nobody's been brave enough to tell me otherwise yet. It just seems amazing. They gently warmed me with hot water in the bell. When I got back to the chambers, they sort of stripped me naked, and they warmed me with a hot shower or a warm shower. Yeah, that's on camera as well, and thankfully they didn't put that in the film. They had a little go at putting an IV line in and failed. You know, that's pretty much the only injury I suffered that night was them trying to put the IV line in. Because I was showing signs of shock. I was vomiting. I wanted to sleep and that kind of thing. So all the classic signs of shock, but physically I was fine, and and I recovered very, very quickly. And within a day or so, I was up and walking around like nothing had happened, really. We always mention this because, in the system we have a DMAC kit, which I don't know what that costs, but tens of thousands of euros. But they say the most valuable piece of equipment they used was a very English thing. So a tea cozy they put on the top of my head. And that's just, maybe half an hour before I got back to the system, or after I got to the system. So yeah, a very, very, very lucky boy, obviously. People always ask me, and I'm sure we're going to discuss that in a minute, the explanation of why I survived. I always assumed at the beginning that it was cold water. We hear stories of children falling into cold water and surviving for very, very long periods, or patients in hospitals being cooled in order to operate on them. So that was definitely a factor. I would have been hypothermic extremely quickly, something I don't remember, incidentally, but we can maybe talk about that later. It seems strange that I don't remember, but I would have been very, very cold very quickly. But I've come to realize since that it was, it's far more to do with the high partial pressures of oxygen that we breathe as divers, particularly as saturation divers, and particularly the gas in my bailout that would have saturated my tissues with oxygen, and, it allowed the essential vital, organs, in particular the brain, to keep functioning, and for the individual cells not to die out. These are all theories, though, we don't really know. And I've been lucky enough to go and talk at the Royal Medical Society in London and to hyperbaric conferences. And, the truth is it's all speculation, and, nobody's ever really given me a very good answer as to why we managed, Very quickly as a last slide, so I can finish up when we get to the questions. But just because we've got a diving audience, I wanted to quickly go over some of the lessons we learned that night. I often say to people that we did learn lots and lots of things that night, but ultimately for us, it was a success story. And it was an example of how, despite the fact that we had this catastrophic single point failure, the procedures that we had in place, the chain of command, the drills that we practiced, all of those came to the fore that night, and enabled my colleagues to effect a rescue, an effective rescue, and save my life. So in a weird way, it was an example of how well things can go, despite the fact that we had this serious issue. But as I said, nonetheless, we did learn a lot of lessons. Some of these were very small things. So just to give you some silly examples, Duncan, who was in the bell, he was when I came back in, he was holding my helmet because my head wouldn't stay up. I was lolling into the water. He takes my helmet off, and my head kept falling, my face kept falling back into the water. So he was looking for a knife to cut my equipment off. And we always keep the knives in the roof of the diving bell, and he couldn't reach them. A silly thing, but just one of the examples of the small things we learned. Dave, when he's trying to bring me back onto the stage, didn't have any handles to grab onto to be able to pull me over in what was a very, very difficult situation. So we learned that. We've since put lights on the umbilicals just to help us with, monitoring them in the dark. And also we've gone on to use to rebreathers, which I'll maybe talk about afterwards, why we didn't use them before. But we've since moved on to a Cobra system, which is a rebreather, which in the same scenario would maybe give us about 40 minutes of breathing gas. So lots of little lessons we learned, but probably the big lessons we learned were cultural lessons, which is what I'm really going to try and leave you with tonight, which is that, that what shocked us the most was these little things hadn't been learned before. Now we, like I'm sure you do, we do diving drills all the time, rescue drills all the time. Hundreds of them have been performed, thousands have been performed on the Topaz, and yet these lessons hadn't been learned. So what that told us was that we weren't doing them properly, and we weren't doing them realistically enough. So we've tried to sort of bring that to our safety culture ever since, which is, realism in our drills, and a real open culture of trying to learn from drills, and everybody having an input into things they've learned from doing them, and not helping your friend to help you rescue you, if you like. That's been a real big thing for us. you know, and probably the last point I'd like to make, I suppose, is that, you know, what hopefully I've shown you tonight a little bit, and what we certainly learned was that, you know, for all the safety practices and boring as dry as they can be, you know, the truth of the matter is, at the end of the day, there's a human being at the end of it, and a human being with a family and, you know, a place to go home to, which we all hear a lot of the time. But, you know, it really is true that the rest of it is not really important. The important thing is that we all come home safely, and that's got to be at the forefront of your mind in everything that you do. And you need to be brave enough to put your hand up and say, I'm not happy with things, or contribute to safety, to you know, contribute your thoughts to everything, because at the end of the day, it is your life and the life of your families as well, which is affected by anything that goes wrong. So, you know, I'll leave you with that one, and that is it. So I've talked a bit too long, so I'm very sorry about that. I think I've run over by 10 minutes. I'll stop sharing my screen, and hopefully there's some questions. But, you know, before I do that, thank you very, very much indeed again to Linda and Sander and the committee, and indeed to all of you. I'm not quite sure how many of you are out there, but you know, thank you very, very much indeed for tuning in. I hope that was understandable to start with, and you know, I look forward to your questions. Okay, thank you. I'll stop sharing. Hi.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I think all those people here in this room, they were silent from first beginning till the end.
I hope that's a good thing. Yeah.
I liked it.
There we go. Okay.
Anyhow, and it was a very interesting story, and I think we all saw the movie. But you know, when you talk about it, it's so different, and it's impressive. One of the questions.
It's a very personal thing, isn't it? You know, and
it is.
It's easy to talk about safety, but yeah, at the end of the day, it's a human being, isn't it? So yeah. Anyway, sorry.
I think there's a lot of lessons learned. But one of the things that came up here was about when you were talking about why did you survive this accident, and I think Thijs, our physician, has some questions about it, or some thoughts about it, and maybe Erwin as well.
Well, thankfully he survived, and I'm looking at the screen, so I'm not looking at the camera, but I'm looking at you there. So I've not all knowledge, right? So I have some thoughts about it. I think one of them is you were saturated, right, with a lot of helium, and we know from studies within cardiac surgery that helium does protect tissue from hypoxic states. So when you don't have enough oxygen, when you put in a lot of helium, the tissue gets damaged less. So that's what we know from cardiac surgery. And we do have some evidence from animal studies that it also works in humans. So you were diving in heliox, so you were the best human experiment you can hope for. And obviously this one has worked. And well, I'm not dying to do it, a lot of other human testing, but that could be one of them. And of course, the cold, the hypothermia. And I'd like to bring out a famous case of a Swedish radiologist. Her name is Anna Begenholm. She went under the ice in 1999, and she has registered a 3-hour period without any cardiac activity. And she survived without minor injuries only afterwards. So being cold really fast does help your body to go in a lower metabolic state. So basically, you need way less oxygen before damage occurs. But obviously, it has been almost 10 years afterwards. Everyone has told you already. But so besides that, I think the last thing that really saved you is having a diving helmet. So you didn't drown. Of course, you were deeply hypoxic. Your body needs oxygen and you didn't get any, but you didn't drown. So when Duncan started giving you mouth-to-mouth breathing, you were getting oxygen. And that combined with cold and possibly helium, I think that saved you, because in the footage you see, you're actually the bluish shirt you're wearing right now. So you're at least hypoxic and probably really cold. So, well, and it's still, I'm not saying a miracle, but it's a really astonishing story. And thankfully you can tell what has happened, and a great documentary has been made about it.
Yeah,
so
that's so yeah. I mean, I've heard some of those things before, but I've never heard so much about the helium. I didn't realize that, to be honest, that it had a protective
I'd like that on camera that I'm the one who put it on first, right?
Yeah, well, definitely. That's going in the presentation. Yeah, that's lovely. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of small things, but you know, the one thing whenever I do talk to physicians is that they feel that the margins must have been infinitesimally small between, you know, survival, particularly undamaged, you know, relatively anyway, to anything worse, you know. So yeah.
So you were asking, do I think it's oxygen toxicity? I think it's not, because oxygen toxicity is often a lot more violent, more seizures, a lot more extreme. And I think you just witnessed twitching from an hypoxic dying body.
No, I agree. I mean, I just, the maths doesn't really work for the toxicity as well. It wasn't long enough, high enough, you know, partial pressure. But yeah, I mean, since the, I only really mention that because I'm not quite sure how you are in the Dutch sector, but in the UK now, IMCA have changed the maximum PPO2 in the bailout because of that footage. Because, you know, there's a doctor called Dr. Bryson who's decided that I'm sure you've heard about that, which I'm bemused me, because I feel that's what saved me, was the high partial pressure, and they, in their wisdom, have decided to reduce it. Read into that what you will.
I would like to make a switch to the emergency drills. You were talking about training the emergency drills. I have two questions, and there's also a question from the audience. How do you train these drills, and what sort of tips do you have to make to do those drills also for the whole diving community, so also for in a recreational setting?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as a commercial diver, those of you who are commercial divers out there, that forms a pretty significant portion of your training is emergency drills. You know, and particularly the diver rescue one. So rescuing an unconscious diver from the seabed is something that we do all the time when you qualify as a diver, but even commercially. So we will do for every period of saturation that we do, so every 28-day saturation, we will always do one. On our boat, we'll do one rescue dive on day one. So the first thing you do pretty much is you'll do 6 hours in the water, and then you will rescue your colleague. So it's something we practice, 7-8 times a year, or whatever, how it depends how many you do, but regularly. And but yeah, as I said, the thing we learned, I mean, we certainly used to do that, our diver rescue at the end of 6 hours in the water. So you'd be working hard for 6 hours, the two of you, and then you're asked to perform this diver rescue, and everybody's tired and just wants to go back for a cup of tea, in truth. So the person you're rescuing will kick their legs and help themselves up onto the stage, and they will make it a little bit easier for the person rescuing. It's human nature. And we found that in doing that, you don't really create a realistic rescue situation. So lots of the little lessons that we learned that night, really should have been learned before and hadn't been. So yeah, that would be my advice, really, is that equally in a recreational environment, that any drill you do, be as realistic as possible. Make it real, because otherwise you don't really learn anything. You may go through the motions, and it definitely helps. Whatever you're doing helps. For Dave coming to get me, that was something he was well practiced in. But nevertheless, if we'd had more realism in our drills, some of the problems they encountered would have been found, earlier, if you like. So yeah, I'm sure that applies to scuba divers and recreational divers just the same. That make it as realistic as possible, because you don't learn anything otherwise, or as much.
And do you have levels in training, like for instance the individual training, group training? One question from the audience is, do you also practice, for instance, DP drills? Do you train that with the whole team? Are there certain levels in your training?
No, the training's pretty standardized. We all do the same thing. As saturation divers, you certainly need an awareness of DP and dynamic positioning issues is key to everything we do, really. So umbilical lengths are restricted because of that. And certainly for the marine crew, more than us, actually, I mean, the truth is, it's not something we really anticipated to that length. You know, the only thing you can really do to prevent a DP problem is to make sure you don't get your umbilical caught, you know, and that is a mantra for every diver is umbilical management, you know, and it's quite hard for me to preach that. But yeah, that's the truth that, you know, you need to always make sure that your umbilical is rooted in such a fashion that it can't be caught, you know, and it can't be snagged on anything. Now, I like to think that that's easier said than done. There are certain situations where it's almost impossible, and that there will be no commercial diver sat in the audience who hasn't had their umbilical caught around something it shouldn't be at some point. So, but yeah, that's the key. Make sure at all times that your umbilical is never caught. But in terms of the dynamic positioning system itself, that was the complete failure of that system was not something we had ever practiced as divers, and it was not something the bridge crew had ever practiced before either. Whenever we arrive on a new location to work, we always go through dynamic positioning trials of the vessel. So that's really just to prove that the system and the thrusters are working effectively. But they had never, for example, practiced having to manually control the vessel. So that's something that's been rectified since. They now, anywhere we go, they allow an extra, I think, half an hour, 45 minutes to allow the crew to practice that kind of thing. It's still a very, very difficult thing to do in open water in bad weather, but nevertheless, you know, we try and cover that kind of thing. It was a strange one because it really was a very, very unusual accident, you know, in terms of that happening. It really, the whole design of these boats is for that never to be able to happen. But, you know, that in itself is a lesson, isn't it? That you really do need to prepare for the impossible to happen, I suppose, and cover every possible scenario. That really wasn't covered in either the diving side or the marine side because it was deemed impossible and it was designed against, you know, that was prevented through design. But yeah, that's not necessarily foolproof. So yeah.
Chris, can I ask you something about the actual rescue?
Please.
I hear there were two obstacles, let's say. One was getting you back to the bell.
Yeah.
You had a hard time getting you back to the bell. And the other thing was that you told me that the orientation was hard because everything went black when your umbilical snapped. Are there any procedures changed, or is the equipment different now according to this accident? Are things changed now?
Yeah, well, we changed. I mean, in terms of the rescue, I mean, not much has changed really because, you know, ultimately it was difficult, but it was successful. You know, he managed to get me back. As I said, we learned little lessons like putting steel handles on the stage. So, you know, it was easier for him to pull me back. And yeah, so yeah, you know, little things like repositioning the knives. But, you know, in terms of fundamental things that we've changed, the biggest one is the rebreather, you know, to prevent that rescue ever being necessary, I suppose, you know, that, you know, having 40, you know, there's another good question in that is if I'd had 40 minutes of gas, would that have saved me? You know, it's difficult to know, you know, because, you know, the physician's putting his hands up there, you know, who knows, you know, if I'd been able to breathe, then I wouldn't perhaps have, my metabolism might not have slowed down and that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's hard to tell, but, you know, I guess extra gas is always a good thing. So that's been the biggest change we've made is the rebreather in terms of the diving side of things. And like I said, we now light the umbilicals up to try and aid your umbilical management and things like that. But yeah, in terms of the rescue, it's really just a cultural shift. As I said, you know, making drills more realistic because, you know, ultimately it was a success story from that front. You know, they were able to come and rescue me.
I have a question to Erwin to put it back to the Dutch situation. You are in commercial diving as well. And of course, you heard about this accident. And did you in Holland in the training change something?
Well, for the training with the closed bell, we tried different rescues. For example, in some occasions, you can use fins to get an unconscious diver back to the bell.
Yeah.
But it's not always the best option. For example, he told about the hot water suit and the boots.
Yeah.
Of course, you want to stay warm. If you put on fins during the whole dive, maybe you will, how do you call it? Get so tight on your feet that your feet get cold. So it's not an option to have fins on all the time.
No.
But maybe on the outside of the bell to have fins for the rescue diver in case of an emergency. You can choose to take fins or not. These kinds of things we are testing when we're doing these trainings.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. We do that exact thing. You know, I can't remember if we had them before, but certainly now, You know, we on the bottom we're always wearing Wellington boots, but we do always carry fins on the bell, exactly, because if it gives the bellman the choice, yeah, if he wants to have it. Because for a long dive you don't want to wear fins on the bottom, it's just not practical. But if you're rescuing someone and you need to fin upwards, absolutely, yeah. So yeah, you're quite right.
And what about diving propulsion systems? We use them in military diving for really long dives. So why you can be propelled by anything with a battery. Is that something that can be used in this type of diving, or does it make you more prone to get stuck into something? Because yeah, everything that's aside from your body, you can get stuck from. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest, that's not something we've really looked into. But yeah, it doesn't. You know, if it was. I think if it was practical, you know, you wouldn't even necessarily need to carry it the whole dive, would you? If it was had a propulsion unit in the vicinity, that might have helped. I mean, in this situation, it would have helped me get back to the bell. It would also maybe, you know, would have given me some options that maybe I didn't want. You know, as in I could have gone to the surface.
Maybe for David, because you were dead weight. Sorry for the words. Yeah. Maybe it helps him lift you aside from a buoyancy or balloon, or that could be dangerous, because if you miss the bell, then you go all the way to the surface. But well,
that would be the main concern I can imagine they would have if you suggested that. But yeah, why not on the stage? Have something on the stage that you could use as a rescue diver. Yeah. We talked a little bit about having inertia reels on the stage, so our umbilicals are in the bell. But I know an old, you know, wet bell systems. They used to be occasionally some. I don't know if any of you older guys remember them, but you know, used to have inertia reels. So the umbilical could be actually the dive supervisor could press a button and it would wind the umbilical back in. You know, might have pulled me back. Obviously, it doesn't work when your umbilical's severed, but you know, for Dave, that might have been helpful, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's definitely options that you know could and probably should be explored. I'll tell them that was my idea, but yeah,
that's fine. That's okay.
Okay,
patent it.
we get a lot of questions or comments from recreational divers as well, and most of them they say, okay, what we have to learn out of this is that we also in recreational diving have to practice drills, have to practice safety. And maybe, Cees, you can say something about it, because in technical diving, it's very common to do so.
Yeah, a lot of drills. But first I have another question, because in recreational diving, we use a backup light.
Yeah, right.
It was also in the chat.
A lot of people told us.
What about an option for a backup light?
Backup light, yeah. I mean, to be honest, it's I think it's a scenario where we just nobody ever considered the possibility of the umbilical being severed. That's the bottom line. So you know, there's never been any necessity to carry a torch. You know, some people do. Some people carry them just for facilitating work. You know, so you can see the other diver or so on. But I carry one now. I'll tell you that now. I carry one now, but a lot of people still don't, you know, and as long as you're unattached your umbilical, you should never need a torch, you know, because you can always find your way back to the bell. You just follow that. And, you know, a lot of the places we work at, a torch makes no difference anyway, because it just refracts and doesn't help you see anything. So look, I think at the end of the day, there's no harm in having one. Being able to see is always going to be a good thing. So why not carry one? So yeah, absolutely. But but just to go back as well to the talk of drills in recreational diving, you know, from my perspective, recreational diving is more dangerous than what we do, simply because I know it sounds strange perhaps, but what we do is so very controlled. You know, I work on a boat with 100, and as I said, I've got 105 people to make sure I'm safely onto the seabed, and all the dangers, the real dangers of, you know, diving. In commercial diving, the dangers are mostly the same dangers you'd have in a building society. It's the cranes, it's things like that are going to hurt you. It's not really the diving side of things. You know, the ascent and descent are your big dangers, aren't they, in recreational diving? And those decisions and those skills are taken away from you as a commercial diver, because I'm lowered to the seabed and I'm decompressed at a very slow rate in a chamber. Whereas you know, recreational diving, you are very much on your own. And so I would say that, you know, your drills and the ability to rescue your dive buddies, isn't it? And then recreational diving is all the more important, you know, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think you also should watch out that a lot of divers, they seek safety in extra equipment or safety features, and you don't want to end up hanged all around with safety features, and you cannot touch safety feature 1 because safety feature 2 is in the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's keep it simple in my book, but absolutely, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, Chris. Diving accidents like yours, are they reported to any governmental or public authority? And is there any investigation about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the industry, certainly in the UK sector of the North Sea, and I'm sure it's the same in the Dutch sector, there's a very, very rigid reporting policy. There is nothing that happens on our boat that is not reported, really. It depends on the severity, but I mean, I'll give you an example. I was on board a couple of weeks ago, and a lift bag went to the surface. You know, it was released, which isn't, you know, a pretty bad mistake. Nobody was hurt. Nothing was damaged, but that is reported to the authorities, to IMCA. It's investigated by the company. Everything stops for something like that. You know, a relatively minor incident, if you like. So, you know, certainly when my accident happened, the ship stopped working for 2 weeks. There's any sort of serious incident like that has to be reported to the government, effectively, to the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive in the UK. Yeah, the days of trying to hide these things have gone, really. Certainly in, you know, the companies I work for, there is it's mandatory, but there's also a culture of reporting, you know, all accidents and all incidents, so that everybody can learn from them. You know, the days of being able to hide things has gone. You can't. Everything is recorded. Everything is on black boxes. You know, there's no hiding anymore, really. So even if you wanted to, you couldn't. But, you know, that culture of reporting is now strong. And, you know, we talked about it a little bit earlier on that, you know, I'm lucky to work in a place where that is the case. And there are a lot of commercial divers around the world who don't work in that kind of reporting culture, which is so important to learning lessons, isn't it? And, you know, I think us as a diving community and the kind of thing that you guys are doing and bringing everybody together is very, very important, because that should be the case everywhere for the sake of our fellow divers, if you like, wherever who aren't.
So in your opinion, it helps really to prevent risks?
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, I'm sure you'd agree. You'd much rather learn from someone else's accident than have to do it yourself, wouldn't you? So anything that happens, however minor, is I think it's very important that these things are reported. And I think that's one of the most critical things to the safety culture we have in the North Sea sector is that culture of reporting and not covering up, you know.
Yeah, so sorry for me starting in Dutch.
No.
So, sorry Chris, maar dat is wel iets waar we in Nederland ook nog echt een stap verder mee kunnen gaan. Hè? Want
ik zou heel graag, kijk, Chris, one of your last slides was the lessons learned. From you can see how valuable this is. In Holland we have, for recreational diving especially, we have an organization, DOSA. Zal ik het even in het Nederlands doen?
Ja, ik zou gewoon...
Ja, I do it in Dutch, Chris, sorry.
Yes, okay.
Kijk, we hebben natuurlijk de DOSA, dat is de duikongevallen statistiek en analyse. Voor de registratie ervan. En als je nou kijkt naar het jaarverslag van 2020, dan zie je dat zeg maar van de 61 beschreven duikongevallen maar 13 uit de eerste hand duikers komen. Mensen die er dus direct bij betrokken zijn geweest. En dat is een cultuur natuurlijk die ons weinig brengt om te kunnen leren van de duikongevallen die we hebben. Als je nu ziet hoe juist dat in de beroepsduikerij dat dan georganiseerd is en geregeld is. En hoe mager wij het zelf doen in het recreatieve duiken. Dat zou een ongelooflijk goede les kunnen zijn voor de recreatieve duiksector. Om veel beter te gaan beschrijven van wat is er nou gebeurd en wat kunnen we ervan leren. Want ik denk juist door dat soort dingen heel goed te gaan beschrijven en ja, daar open in te zijn. In plaats van de cultuur van het te verbergen, want dat is natuurlijk wat er heel erg gebeurt. Dan kunnen we veel beter statistieken opbouwen en veel meer gaan bijdragen aan de veiligheid, in ieder geval ook in het recreatieve duiken.
Maar waar komt dat verbergen vandaan? Is dat schaamte volgens jou? Is dat omdat families of betrokkenen het niet willen?
Leo, misschien weet jij daar iets meer over. Het zou schaamte kunnen zijn, maar het kan ook de angst zijn voor een claim.
Ik denk dat de angst voor een claim vaak misbruikt wordt.
Ja.
Er wordt vaak gezegd van, als er maar geen claim komt. En daar wordt aan gekoppeld van, nou dan zeg ik het maar niet. Maar het is eigenlijk andersom. Eigenlijk is het een soort schaamte. Van ik wil dat niet, zou ik iets fout gedaan hebben?
Ja.
Dat is dan vervolgens zeer nadelig voor afhandeling van claims. Dus een van de lastigste dingen die je in de juridische wereld hebt, dat we daar niet open over zijn. We kunnen dus niet, je krijgt dus een hele lastige weging van factoren.
Ja.
So just to recap, Cees was telling we should have a more just culture or a culture where we report accidents, and our lawyer just said, well, it's really hard from a legal point of view because we're not being open to it. I think that's one of the questions I saw in the chat as well. So you are diving, right? After the incident, a few weeks later, a few months later, you continue diving. Have you ever heard something about legal claims, or do divers do not want to dive with you because you're bad luck? Or could you tell something about the just culture, if you want to call it, in commercial diving, from your experience?
I heard the words claim and legal case. Yeah, so I kind of guessed what you were talking about. So from my point of view, my perspective from my incident, ultimately, I never went down that road because there was nothing wrong with me. It was if I'd pursued that, it would have been fraudulent, to me anyway, and a lie, because I was fine. I was healthy. I had a fright, obviously, but I didn't feel traumatized by it. I didn't feel I wasn't hurt physically. So yeah, I'm sure I could have pursued. We are unionized in the North Sea Divers, so we are a member of the Rail and Maritime Transport Union. So we have facility to use their legal departments for that kind of thing. Obviously, I could have gone privately and pursued some kind of claim, and I probably could have had if I'd said I couldn't go diving again, I'm sure I would have had a good claim, and that would have been. I'm fairly confident that would have been settled had I decided to go down that road. But I didn't. It's just not the kind of person I am, really. And I was fine. If I felt like I couldn't work again, that would have been different. But I was fine. But yeah, to go back to maybe the bigger point in terms of the availability of that to other divers, certainly in where I am, that's definitely available to them. Yeah. I'm working quite a bit with a French organisation called SCAF Motion, they're called, and they're trying to sort of put forward the cause of what we call civils divers in the UK, but in France. So not offshore divers, inshore divers who really do lag behind in those kind of things and the standards on their work sites, but also the fact that their clients. So not so much the diving contractors, but the clients who employ the diving contractors are not liable, don't seem to be liable for accidents which happen on their work sites. And they've got a lot of serious, lots of cases of divers being injured and unable to pursue, legal, compensation, which is a big problem for them. But that's not really the case where I work. There's pretty strong legal sort of structures, if you like, in place as to who is responsible. So where I work, the contractor, so my direct employer is responsible, but the client, so in my case, the oil company is also responsible for safety standards and on their work site. So there's a dual responsibility, if you like, in terms of liability. So yeah, we've got pretty strong structures in place to deal with that kind of thing. Yeah.
And a good liability insurance, I presume.
Yeah, the companies will have. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Personally, I don't really need it. I don't think. Yeah, because we're insured by our employers. Yeah.
Employer, yes. Yeah.
So can I come a question as a physician, because you recovered well also from a psychological perspective. You also told that there are 105. Yeah, you see you're going there. That's okay. There's not a medical thing, right? But you know, any of the crew, 105 people were on board. Perhaps one of them, did they suffer any post-traumatic stress issues? Perhaps even the cook or the guy who failed in his technical procedures, or one of your co-divers. Do you know any of them?
Absolutely, you know, exactly. I mean, that's what I tried to touch upon a little bit when in the presentation was that, yeah, you would think sort of the three of us in the water were the ones who suffered, and yeah, strangely, none of us have. And I think a lot of that is because well, for me, I'm unconscious through most of it, so it doesn't really, I don't remember anything anyway. But yes, you know, as I said, we almost had the joy and the satisfaction of getting through it. And in a strange way, we went back to dive in more confident in what we did. I think we all have our doubts about whether you would be able to get out of a situation like that, or as a bellman, whether you'd be able to rescue divers, you know, if it really came down to it in that situation. So, you know, because we'd had, from our perspective, a success story, really, you know, we felt quite good about the whole thing, and we went back to it very happy. And I don't think any of us have really suffered since. But absolutely, yeah, I've had colleagues who've absolutely had sleepless nights. And as one example, just the guy who maintains the diving helmets in our boat, you know, which functioned perfectly. And, you know, you talked about, you know, the crucial thing was I didn't drown, and you're absolutely right. And, you know, he has nightmares about, you know, not having, you know, having put the non-return valves in the wrong way around or something like that, and, you know, the hat flooding. And yeah, it's incredible how it affects. And that, I'm sure that's true of all traumas, you know, of traumas at war and things like that. It's not necessarily the people directly involved. Trauma can be a far-reaching thing psychologically, and yeah, we've definitely found that to be true. The ROV pilot, as another example, so the guy who was driving the ROV that found me, he was very, very upset. To the point where he didn't want to be involved with the making of the film. We made a smaller one originally, and he was involved with that, and he gets very emotional in that, and he decided he didn't want to be involved with the second film, and he decided at that time never to work with divers ever again. You know, he was definitely affected pretty deeply by it all. He was put under a certain amount of pressure. They were asking him if he would consider coming to fetch me with his manipulator arm and pick me up and carry me back to the bell, and he was very reluctant to do that. You know, he didn't have to in the end, thankfully, but you know, those sort of things affected him. And yeah, so you're absolutely right. It's not just those directly involved. It can have a deep effect on a lot of people.
And a closing thought on that one, because what you're telling is actually, it's known in medical science, but outside of it probably isn't, because the people actually involved in the trauma, they had actually something to do. Duncan was holding your line, and everyone else has a bystander effect. So in Belgium and also in the Netherlands, there is a working group when people have had diving trauma. So you can contact them, really, please do so, because more often bystanders or just someone who's seeing the accident happen, not directly involved, also suffers psychological complaints, or perhaps even more. So I'd like to take this opportunity to please, if you ever had any trouble, and ask around not only your buddy, but also someone else in the parking lot, basically. And if you have any problem, please do not refrain from seeking medical help, or at least body-to-body attention, because going through something like this can really change your life. Obviously, your life, but someone else's life as well.
No, that's fantastic to hear that something like that exists. Yeah, and yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think, as you said, I think because we were able to affect the outcome, you know, we don't suffer as much. I'm quite sure that's true. Yeah.
Even ter verduidelijking, Thijs, bij wie kunnen mensen dan terecht? Waar sportduikers, beroepsduikers, waar?
De Nederlandse Onderwatersportbond heeft een commissie die daar speciaal voor in het leven geroepen is. Meer laagdrempelig, duiker naar duiker, iemand die de omstandigheden begrijpt om gewoon je verhaal te doen. En daar hoeft er is geen kosten aan verbonden, dat hoeft niet te leiden tot medische hulp. Gewoon op een goede manier je verhaal kunnen doen, dat in context plaatsen, dat helpt een heleboel voor voor duikers. Ja. En onze Belgische collega's bij de dienstvereniging. Ja.
Ja, mooi. Ja. En er werd net gesproken over de just culture, hè? Dus met name over gedrag. In hoeverre vinden wij dat in opleidingen in Nederland voldoende aandacht krijgt?
Ik denk dat er al wel een cultuuromslag is in opleidingen. Vroeger werd, zoals al verteld werd, een beetje de macho opgeleid. Duiken is een stoere beroep, dus vooral je hoofd onder water houden en niet zeuren. Ik denk dat er al wel een omslag is dat moet eerst iemand leren veilig duiken en weten wat duiken is zonder problemen. Voordat je hem onder water houdt en de problemen in aanraking laat komen. Een voorbeeldje is, als je in de opleiding mensen vertelt dat een klein lekje in je pak normaal is, dat dat standaard is, dan weet hij dus nooit hoe het is om met een fatsoenlijk pak te duiken. En als ik dat al doorgeef aan de volgende duiker, van ja, niet klaar hè? In mijn opleiding was het ook altijd een beetje nat. Dat is geen goede cultuur en dat is nu wel zeg maar, veranderd. Dat je steeds meer merkt dat als je een probleem hebt, melden, probleem helpen, dan pas doorgaan. En niet denken van hier kan ik wel mee duiken. Want het ene probleem resulteert in het volgende probleem. En uiteindelijk ligt erbij.
Ja. Nou, ik zie hier ook een comment in de chat. Dat het bestaan van de DOSA, daar hebben we het net ook al over gehad. Of dat ook constant onder de aandacht gebracht kan worden tijdens opleidingen. Dat ook een hele goede is. Het zou ook een van de oproepen moeten zijn. En dat deed jij net ook al, Cees, voor vanavond. Dat als je bij een ongeval betrokken bent geweest, van meld het. Daar kunnen we van leren.
Nou, ik denk dat binnen de opleiding wordt er heel veel aandacht gegeven aan veiligheid. Dat is de ene kant die juist heel goed belicht wordt. Ik denk dat de andere kant, wat als er iets gebeurt, dat onderbelicht is in de opleiding. Ik denk dat we dat wel ter harte kunnen nemen, dat we misschien die kant ook beter zouden kunnen gaan belichten.
Maar moeten we niet eerst zeggen dat duiken veilig is?
Duiken is zeker veilig.
Ja.
Wat je al zegt, hoe dieper en hoe moeilijker en ingewikkelder het wordt, hoe veiliger het eigenlijk wordt.
Ja.
De meeste ongelukken die gebeuren toch echt in ondieper water met een wat simpelere uitrusting. En niet als het heel erg diep en gevaarlijk lijkt. Want juist dan zijn er heel veel noodmaatregelen en procedures om dat te voorkomen.
Let's continue in English because we're talking about diving is safe. But what I'm wondering is how commercial divers or Navy divers, how do you consider recreational diving? Is it a monkey way of diving or is it the same? Or I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're talking to the wrong guy because I like both. So no.
Okay, Erwin.
Well, I think you have
whatever. Chris, do you mind if Erwin answers in Dutch or?
No, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Meerdere stromingen als het gaat over beroepsduikers. Je hebt natuurlijk vanuit de sportduikers de mensen die vooral geïnteresseerd zijn in het duiken zelf. En de duiktechniek die erbij komt kijken. En je hebt natuurlijk ook een hoop duikers die meer geïnteresseerd zijn in de werkzaamheden die gedaan worden. Dus die hebben de technische achtergrond. En ja, dan is duiken een bijzaak, laat ik zo zeggen. En dat zijn eigenlijk een beetje de twee takken als je het hebt over commercieel duiken. En dan heb je natuurlijk de archeologen en biologen die zeg maar, vanuit dat vakgebied gaan duiken. Ja, en we dus duiken natuurlijk ook een tweede...
En dan ga je de omslag maken. Want Cees zit natuurlijk heel erg in het technisch duiken, in het grondduiken, in het wrakduiken.
Ja, maar ook in het recreatieve duiken.
En ook in het recreatieve duiken.
Ja.
Maar hoe kijk jij tegen commercial divers aan?
Rare mensen.
Ja.
Nee,
maar wat kan je van ze leren?
Nee, heel veel. Dat is natuurlijk heel grappig. Want gisteren ben ik bij DC-opleidingen geweest. En dat is natuurlijk uit interesse. Dat we juist ook in de beroepsopleidingen wat kunnen we gaan toevoegen. We hebben leuke plannen mee om ook wat extra aandacht te geven aan het vervolg van stel je voor dat je iets in beroepsopleidingen zou willen doen. Dus wat kunnen we van leren? Dat is wat we gaan optuigen. Dus dat vinden we bij ons duikcentrum heel erg leuk om te doen. Maar wat jij net zei, ja, duiken is natuurlijk wel heel erg veilig. Want als je ziet hoe ontzettend veel recreatieve duikbewegingen gemaakt worden en hoeveel honderden duiken in 1 weekend gemaakt worden. En hoe ontzettend weinig incidenten er dan statistisch zijn op die duikbeweging, kun je wel zeggen, het is super veilig. Het enige wat je zou kunnen zeggen, kunnen we het nog veiliger dan het nu al is. Door aan bepaalde dingen misschien extra aandacht te geven. En dat kunnen bijvoorbeeld zijn bepaalde drillsprocedures, en noem dat maar op. Misschien juist wat meer aandacht aan zeg maar het rescue gedeelte van de opleidingen. Noem het maar op. Maar ik denk dat je zeker kunt zeggen dat duiken ontzettend veilig is. Super veilig. Maar het kan ook beter. En daarom denk ik dat het zo belangrijk is dat juist zo'n DOSA, dat het ook een bepaald bestaansrecht gaat krijgen. Waardoor we gewoon niet schromen om te durven te vertellen van wat is er gebeurd bij een incident en wat kunnen anderen daarvan leren.
Dat is de grote les.
Dat is de les.
Ja.
And I'd like to add, because to respond to one of the comments, we agreed beforehand that we would take part of the discussion in Dutch, and Chris wouldn't mind. So
that's fine. Yeah.
So basically, we agreed on both commercial sides and technical and recreational diving. It's safe because of the amount of diving versus the amount of accidents. But I think all accidents have one thing in common, just like yours. It's a consecutive series of events that lead to an accident, and it could be something. A bad plan, like someone who's diving with the wrong equipment on the wrong place in the wrong time with the wrong skills, and then ultimately it leads to an accident. And then you all have so many checks and balances that can prevent an accident. And one of them is equipment, one of them is drills, one of them is medical status or anything like that. So I think the most important quote I've ever read about diving safety, it's in the book here. I'm gonna show it. It's this book by Gareth Locke, and it's Under Pressure. It's an excellent read if you haven't so. Sorry for that. The basic statement is, I am fallible. The only question is when. So in Dutch, I'm repeating this: ik zal fouten maken. De vraag is alleen wanneer. So, and if you inherently adopt that principle that everyone will make mistakes, so will you, then it's no longer shameful to make mistakes. It's logical to make mistakes, and we should learn. That's the second most important quote from the book: is we don't learn from our failures, and we learn even less from our successes. So we should definitely have more of this in-depth analysis, because what you went through, it's exciting, but it's also really educational. So how on earth did 5 backup systems fail in a row, and still you managed to get out alive because of luck? I'm not sure, but it's same with diving. There are so many divers who skip their equipment check, who skip their body check, who dive deeper than they planned, and ultimately it goes fairly safe. But we should stop doing that. We should make better plans. We should talk about our mistakes, right?
That's very eloquently put. I couldn't have said it any better myself. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, absolutely right. And I think you're right. I think the same, whatever the format of diving, it makes no difference. The same rules apply, and they're different. They're very different things. Commercial diving and scuba diving. I wouldn't say there's any more skill in one than the other. It's but yeah, absolutely. The fundamentals of doing certain things, checking, as you say, checking your equipment, and exactly as you say, that every one of us is fallible, and your equipment is fallible, and so on and so forth. So yeah, you need to.
We're now talking about risk assessment. Do you do a sort of a last minute risk assessment before you actually start a dive?
Yeah. I mean, we are, risk assessed to death, I would say. We have generic risk assessments that everything that happens on board, everything, the diving probably least of all, actually. But yeah, in terms of the diving, in terms of anything that happens on board, a crane movement, everything is risk assessed. And more importantly, we have what we call these days, we have what we call management of changes. So if we feel everything we do is proceduralized these days, and if there is to be any kind of diversion or digression from that procedure, then it automatically triggers what we call a management of change, which is an all stop, a risk assessment of what we're changing, because that's, you know, that often, again, that's when accidents happen is, you know, they often happen with repetitive processes, obviously, but, you know, quite often they happen when we change something that's been, you know, agreed beforehand and just decide to do it off the cuff, and we don't really allow that to happen anymore. Everything stops. It's risk assessed in the moment by everybody aboard, and the change of plan is agreed and documented. You know, very importantly, everything is documented these days. So, yeah, absolutely, risk assessments all round. Yeah.
What about equipment? Is the equipment becoming safer and safer and safer?
Well, I think you just told about the bailout system.
Yeah.
He was using an open bailout system, and there are new systems that are rebreathers, and of course you can have longer breathing gas with this equipment, but it's more technical, so also more likely to not work because the technique. Yeah.
I'd agree with that. I mean, yeah, I think what you're saying is absolutely right there. So we have this new system, and I'm going to be honest with you. You know, I'm not sure my employers would like to hear me say this, but I'd rather have the 10 minutes of gas that I know is definitely going to work than 40 minutes of gas which might work. You know, and the strange thing about diving is a lot of the fundamentals of the diving equipment actually haven't changed that much, have they? For the last 30 years, really. You know, there isn't much difference between the old standard equipment people used to use and the hats we have now. You know, the fundamentals are the same, really, because it's tried and tested, and it's simple and it works, really.
That's for the commercial part, but what about the recreational part?
No, that's true. Yeah.
Is equipment getting safer?
Yeah, I think looking over the whole line of equipment, the equipment is very safe, but it's how we use the equipment. Yeah. If we don't control it before we dive, yeah, you don't know if it will be okay or not. So the buddy check is still where it all starts. And when analyzing some diving accidents, I had to do that. It all starts with procedures and mostly with equipment not checked.
So it's the human factor.
It's a human factor.
Maintenance.
So yeah, so maintenance is also a human factor, right?
Yeah.
Bringing your gear in for servicing. Yeah. To answer your question, is equipment getting better? I think the answer is inherently yes.
Yes.
Equipment probably isn't getting worse.
No,
but it ultimately gives divers more ways to harm themselves. And I'm putting it a bit blunt, but if previously you could only dive to 20 meters for 5 minutes, then decompression sickness wouldn't be an issue. But now with all these systems, we can put guys in for months at depth, and then explosive decompression is a new problem we didn't have when we didn't have that equipment.
Yeah.
So I think the human factor is ultimately the most important factor in safety. Yeah, that's true.
Well, that's what we can improve.
Yeah, there's always the danger that you're lulled into a false sense of security through equipment, isn't there? But yeah, fundamentally, it can never be a bad thing to have better equipment. But exactly as you say, it needs to be managed and checked, and there's always the danger of a human failure, isn't there? Yeah, absolutely.
It's always better to talk about equipment. That's more safe than talk about your own behavior.
Yeah. But I think this is perfect moment to wrap up this meeting. We've been listening to you and talking to all these people for 2 hours now. Of course, we hope that our next Congress will be a physical one, a live one, and we can meet all of you. But very soon, next month, there is a medical congress, and it's not just for physicians, but also for divers, commercial and recreational. Thijs, you are the organizer. Please tell me something. Maybe you can do this in Dutch.
All right. Ja, je had me al voorbereid, maar toch ben ik verrast over. 19 juni hebben wij een duikmedisch symposium over duiken en hyperbare geneeskunde. Waarin we een aantal wereldbekende sprekers, zoals Simon Mitchell, ik denk de allergrootste held op het gebied van decompressieziekten. En Jacek Kot, dat is onze collega uit Polen, die heel veel weet over hyperbare zuurstof. En onze eigen Rob van Hulst, hoogleraar hyperbare geneeskunde, met heel veel vulling natuurlijk, op een heel dagprogramma. Maar het is gratis, het is online, dus hop erin als je denkt, dat vind ik een leuk praatje. Het een en ander staat op LinkedIn. Zou je dat ons morgen kunnen delen?
Ik zet morgen nog een keertje op LinkedIn van Wij Duiken Veilig.
Ja, en het is gratis, hop in als het iets leuks is. En als je niks vindt, ga alsjeblieft iets anders doen. Maar het is vooral leuk voor iedereen die zich serieus bezighoudt met duiken. Dankjewel voor de mogelijkheid.
Oké, ja. Nou, we zijn heel erg benieuwd. Chris, I'm going to thank you so much for this presentation and for staying with us and answering all those questions. Sander, Leo, Erwin, Cees, Thijs, thank you so much for being here. Somebody you haven't seen yet, but she is working all the techniques of this meeting is Wendy from the exhibition company, together with Patrick van Brienen. Dank jullie wel. En natuurlijk hebben we een aantal sponsoren die dit mogelijk hebben gemaakt. Dat zijn Amilco Sport. Joep, ik weet dat je zit te kijken, dus dank je wel. Hightech, Duikvaker en Scuba Academie. Allemaal bedankt dat dit kon gebeuren. Willen jullie meer weten en Wij Duiken Veilig volgen? We hebben een website, wijduikenveilig.nl. En we hebben een pagina op LinkedIn waar we ook nieuws voor duikpro's in de recreatieve sector, maar ook professionele duikers in de commercial sector proberen te plaatsen. Dus volg dat vooral, daar zul je ook meer horen over het volgende congres. Ik wens jullie allemaal een goede avond. Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you, yeah. Thank you thank you very much indeed for having me and for listening so patiently. And yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Lovely to talk to you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.